Good morning, or at least morning where I am. This is part 2 of a video series that I'm making where I'm writing a complete expert advisor, including testing and some optimization. And I'm just going very slowly through this, so it's quite aimed at a beginner level, although there might be some more advanced topics that I cover as I go. This is part 2, as I said. If you haven't seen part 1, you might be a little bit lost if we just jump in here. So I will leave a link in the description to part 1. Now also, if you've seen part 1, I'm not structuring these videos to achieve a particular point in the development of the code. I'm really just running them for a certain length of time, and when I get close to that kind of time limit, I just find a logical place to stop. So I'm not sure how much I'm going to cover today. There will be more parts. I'm going to finish everything, but I will just go until I kind of run out of time today. So I've got my stopwatch. Took this out of the back of a Windows 95 computer. I'm going to start that now, and then we'll see how far we go. Okay, I have the code up here. What I've done since the last time, I've simply renamed, this is the Breakout Set and Forget Expert Advisor, and I've just renamed that as Set and Forget 1 because I'm going to copy this and start a version 2 rather than actually modify this one, just mainly to keep the history there. I'm going to make a copy of this as Set and Forget number 2, and then we will move on. And to do that, I'm just going to use this file save as. Set and Forget 2. All right, and when you do that, you don't see the new version here straight away. You just have to refresh, which you can either do with right click and refresh, or just press F5. And now there is my Breakout Set and Forget 2, and that's already the one here because I've done the save as from here. I will just change the version number. It's not strictly a new version because we didn't really finish the expert so far, but I'll just change the version number. Okay, now I did say I would mention where there are differences between Metatrader 5 and Metatrader 4. In Metatrader 4, you should add property strict. It would look something like this. That property strict keyword simply tells the Metatrader 4 compiler to use the new compiler syntax, which is the same syntax as used by Metatrader 5, and it's a more modern syntax. It is there because Metatrader 4 has existed for some time, and there was already code existing before MetaQuotes moved to the new syntax. And so to maintain compatibility, they've added this keyword. Any Metatrader 4 code that doesn't have this keyword uses the old syntax, and Metatrader 4 with this keyword uses the new syntax. I recommend always use it. It's much better. If you do include this in the Metatrader 5 code, it has no impact. Metatrader 5 simply ignores that statement. And so I will at times leave this in code that is in Metatrader 5 simply because it's the same code for Metatrader 4 and 5. It just saves me worrying about having different copies. Now, last time we got as far as putting in the validation for all of the input ranges for hours and minutes. It's worthwhile also putting in some validation for things like these range gaps and stop loss take profit, because you don't want them to be less than 0. So it's not the same validation here. I'm just going to add the validation, for example, for the range gap and the stop loss, and then I'll simply duplicate some of them. I can start by copying this statement. And I'll change this to range gap, which I don't want to be less than 0. So I don't need to have a test on the end of the range gap. And then I can simply put range gap. And that must be greater than 0. But now if I look at the stop loss pips, that could be 0, and I'm going to allow 0 as a way of setting no stop loss. This strategy does require a stop loss, but if you for some reason want to run without that, I'm going to allow you to enter 0. So the test for the stop loss is going to be slightly different. Copy that again. And now that I've done that, I notice I should have said range gap is less than or equal to 0. My mistake, but I fixed it now. But stop loss pips can be equal to 0. So if stop loss pips is less than 0, then stop loss must be greater than or equal to 0. So slight differences there. And now I'll just do the same for the take profit because they are the same as stop loss. I'm going to allow you to put 0 for take profit. I'm not doing anything with a 0 take profit at the moment, but I'm going to set it up so that later if you enter 0 as one of the take profits, then you simply won't take that trade. It's a way of maybe not having 3 different trades. And then I can simply copy that for the other 2 take profits. Now in part 1 I showed how these work, and when you run the Expert Advisor you can detect the error and it will return this init parameters incorrect and simply terminate the Expert Advisor. I'll just compile this to make sure I haven't made a mistake. Whoa. Range gap should be range gap pips. There we go. Compile again. That's fine. So last time I demonstrated this and I've just compiled it, so I'll demonstrate that again. So I have breakout set and forget 2. The chart is empty. I'll drag it on in my inputs. The hour, I'm just going to make that say 30, and I'll make the minutes 88. Okay, so I've got 2 errors in here. And I say OK, and I get the alert telling me that the hour must be from 0 to 23, but I don't get an error on the second, so I'll happily go back in and fix that hour 188. And now I have to go through getting a second error. So just as a usability feature, what we can do is begin here with setting up a boolean inputs OK equals true. So I'm going to use this to detect if there's an error in any of the inputs, or to record if there's an error in any of the inputs. And then instead of this return init parameters incorrect, I'm simply going to say inputs OK equals false. And now if I put that instead of the return statement, and then at the end of this, I can say if not, the exclamation mark is the not symbol. If not, inputs OK. Return init parameters incorrect. Now if I compile that back here, if I now take my breakout set and forget 2, drag that onto the chart, hour 30, minutes 88. Now you can see I already have the 2 alerts from the earlier errors here. I'll just click OK. You have to ignore the 2 earlier alerts. If I can. Now I get both of the error messages at the same time. So that's just a little usability thing. Rather than give people 1 error message at a time, give them all of the error messages and then exit the code, and that way they can fix all of the problems at one time and they don't go back in and get 1 more error after error. move on to the next. I'm also going to validate risk percent, which must be greater than 0. I'll just do a quick copy and paste for that. So risk must be greater than 0. You may want to put some other limit on this, because obviously being greater than 0 as a decimal, you could put a very small fraction in there, but I suppose that's the fault of the end user if they put something that's too small to use. But I'm at least putting a validation here that it must be greater than 0. Now the reason I wanted to go to this is because I've set risk percent as a double, and I've entered 1 by default. I think I've entered 1 by default. There's 1. But throughout the code, I could, whenever I use risk percent, say risk percent divided by 100. But it seems to me silly to keep making a calculation that is never going to change. So I'm going to put in a single definition of a global variable called risk, and I'm going to set that to risk percent divided by 100, and I'll just use risk through the rest of the code, so I don't need to keep repeating that divided by 100. It's not a great example because I think in this code I'll probably only use it in one place, but this is just something that I'm trying to show in terms of how to write this code. So here in the global space, I'm going to put I'm going to declare my variable that I'm calling risk, and in the inputs, after I've been through all of these tests, I put that risk equals INP risk percent divided by 100. So it's one time and done, and I don't need to worry about this again. There will be other variables that we can do this with, but that's the one that I'm using as the example right now. Now I mentioned the global space. Within the code we have these functions, onInit and onDinit and onTick, and we'll be writing some other functions soon as well. Anything that is not inside a function is considered to be in the global space. So we've got this double risk equals 0, that's the global space. And any variables I declare there are called global variables. Don't get confused, if I go back to the terminal, don't get confused with these global variables that you'll find on the terminal. They are actually values that are stored inside the terminal that can be seen by expert advisors on all of the charts, all of the different expert advisors. These are called global variables because they live inside the global scope, and they've been called global variables since before Metaquotes created this language. So if you want to use a different name, go ahead. I'm going to be calling these global variables. It doesn't really matter where I put that. If I remove that and try to compile, I should get an error because I've used risk down here without it being defined. I have sometimes seen people declare global variables in other places. And that will still compile because the compiler finds all of that global space before it compiles any of the functions. Although I've seen people declare global variables, they are sometimes declared just ahead of functions where they're used. I've never really liked that. So I'm going to declare my global variables here. And I might also put a heading before that. Right, global variables. And since I mentioned the global scope, I'll just talk a little bit about general scope of variables. And I'm going to do that down here I'll go right down to the end of the code and I'll put in a dummy function. So there's my dummy function. I'm going to put a conditional statement in here. if I compile, this should be fine. Yes. So what I've done is declare this variable A and the variable B that uses A inside the scope of this if statement, so inside these brackets. If I move that int B statement outside those and try to compile, I'll get an error because the scope of the variable A is just within this space in the if statement. Now I'm trying to use it here and it simply no longer exists. That's just the way the scope works. And that's a good thing, because it means if I want to reuse the variable name A inside another if statement or inside a for loop or something like that, I can use it because this particular version of A is no longer used. If I do the opposite, and if I declare A here and put my int B inside that scope, that will compile. A is declared inside the scope now of this function, and B is inside the scope of the if statement, which means that A is declared at a higher level. So B can still use A as long as B is at a lower level, or this int B statement can use the A variable because it's declared at a higher level of scope. And it would be the same if I put A onto the global scope. I can compile that and it works. So that's just a little note on using scope. The other thing I'll mention about global scope, so I'm just talking about some general things here. I'm sorry we're not writing code for a minute or two. I can declare double risk equals 0 there. If I include a statement here on the global scope like risk equals risk plus 2, I get an error. Variable already defined, see previous ambiguous access. So the global scope is for defining variables, but it's not for writing any code to do any kind of operation. I can change this default value of 0, I can change that to 2 if I like and compile. So I can do assignments of values here, but I can't then perform any operations inside the global scope. All of that must be done inside functions. So now I've talked about the global variables a little. I'm going to talk a little bit about style. You'll notice that when I've declared this global variable, I've simply called it double, and I've called it risk, and I begin this with an uppercase R for risk. You can see all my inputs are INP and then a variable name. The variable name begins with an uppercase letter. I don't generally use underscores. Some people do. Some people will also put a G in front of things like these global variables. Some will even go as far as to add something to the beginning of a variable name that defines what it is. So it could be GD for global double, something like that. If you have a particular style that you want to use it. There are quite a few people who promote what they call best practice. I'm going to tell you what I think is best practice. And best practice is the practice that works best for you. Now, I write this, I'm on my own, I'm not part of a team, so I can make up my own rules. And I make up rules that work for me. If you are part of a team, then you really should agree amongst the team in terms of how you're going to write your style. It's more important to have a consistent style than to have a particular style. So some people, as I said, like to have a G in front of these global variables. Some people like to use underscores instead of the camel cases. I've used it called camel because you get these bumps where you have the uppercase letters. This is my style. INP for inputs. Global variables begin with an uppercase letter. You can run into a bit of trouble if you use a global variable called risk and you also have a function that's just called risk, because my functions also begin with an uppercase letter. But I've honestly never had that a problem. So I'll deal with that if it comes up and probably just change the name of either the function or the global variable. So that's just a note on style. One other thing I want to mention, and this, it may seem trivial, but this is really important. I've declared risk here and assigned the value 0. I could have simply assigned IMP risk percent divided by 100. I could have done that. This will compile and it will work. And in fact, I will put a line of code in here So I'm just calling up the alert statement here and I'm printing the risk percent, which is just the IMP risk percent and the risk from that. If I compile, I'm getting these warning messages because I'm converting from number to string by concatenating numbers with, in fact, I'll take those out. If I just put string here, it will just do a quick conversion of those numbers to strings. I was going to say that warning's not too important because I'm just doing it for demonstration here, but it does bother me. Okay, so now if I go here, breakout set and forget, I can say, okay, risk percent equals 1.0 and risk equals 0.01. So that's exactly what I would expect. Let me go back into the code. I'll take out this line for now because I'm doing this demonstration. So in this case, I've done the risk assignment in here. In part 1, I mentioned that onInit is called every time you change any of the inputs. So I'm going to now go in and change an input. I'll just remove this first from the chart. I'll make sure I've done a compile so I've got the latest version of that. So breakout, set and forget, I drag it on. I've got my risk percent here at 1. I'll just make that 3 just to show that we're doing something different. The alert comes up. I have risk percent equals 3, risk equals 0.03. I close that, and now if I go and change the properties, and make it 5, and I look at my alert, risk percent equals 5, exactly as I expected, but risk is still 0.03. Now this is what the really important thing is. This assignment happens once and once only until you actually restart the expert. So if you remove it or restart Metatrader. Statements inside the onInit function are called anytime you change the inputs or if you change the symbol on the chart or the time frame. So any of those things that you might want to reset, you should put the assignment statement in here. And so if I just change this back to 0, and in here I put so now if I put that assignment statement in here, risk equals risk percent divided by 100, I'll compile that, remove this expert so I know that I have the new version, remove, breakout, set and forget 2, make that 3% to begin. Here my statement, risk percent equals 3, risk equals 0.03. I go here and change the properties. I'll make it 7. Risk percent equals 7, risk equals 0.07. So I said it was a little thing, but very important. If you forget about that and you assign something in here and your end user goes into the inputs and changes the value, you could get very unexpected results. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. This also means that you can store values in this global space that you know if the end user goes in and changes something, they will be remembered. Just don't do it with things that are based on the inputs or where you actually want to know something that's current. So if I stored, for example, the current chart symbol or the current chart time frame in here, that's not going to be reset when I simply go and change any of the inputs or change the symbol or the time frame on the chart. So anything that you actually want to change, if it changes on the chart, perform the initialization in here. Anything that you actually want to remember constantly as the expert is running, put it here. But also, and we'll talk about this later, you need to deal with cases where the expert might be restarted for some reason. And a restart isn't always going to be planned restart. I know there is the on D init. We have the on D, scroll down. We have the on D init here, but I like to write my experts assuming that's not going to be called, because I like to plan for things like an unexpected failure of Metatrader or an unexpected power failure. So I like to write experts so that they just work whatever happens. Okay, so there we are. I'll put this statement back because I like it at the end of the on init, and I'll remove these two lines. So sorry we didn't get far enough today, but I have taken you through a number of things, and in particular remember that tip about initializing values in the global scope and what happens then if someone changes the values of those in the inputs while the expert is running. So remember, if this is useful to you, click the like button. It helps me and it helps other people to find the video. And if you want to see more videos, click subscribe and click the bell icon to get a notification. Now, the notification doesn't work all the time. That's run by Google and YouTube, but at least it helps. So until the next time, thanks for watching.